all good to go.
Okay, we're going to get ready, Ryan.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming. We're gonna, right? You know what I'm talking about. We don't have to. Well, if we say it, I mean, anybody superstitious? If we say the word, will it happen then, or should we not say it, or should we say it's not gonna? Well, whatever. We're good. You're here. You're safe. If anything, if the alarms go off, we'll go to the basement. Nah, there's no basement. So whatever. But the bathrooms are right down the hall. That's my left. I'm not sure for you, but just head down that way. There's pretzels. There's lemonade. There's iced tea. Again, we thank you for coming. We appreciate everyone for just, again, all good stuff. And we are glad to be a part of all that. The Underground Railroad in our area. How cool is that? I mean, that's something we should all be proud of our heritage. So, and again, we're Tabor United Methodist Church. If you're looking for a church family, we'd love to either come here. Again, we're studying right now why God doesn't make sense sometimes. So if you ever had that experience, that's what we're talking on Sundays about, why God doesn't make sense. And we'd love, it's at 9 a.m., a little earlier for my blood, but hey, well, there it is, 9 a.m. Early bird gets the worm. But again, thank you for coming. Please stay as long as you like, or if you have any questions or talking or with anybody. We love our historical society. They're doing great stuff, a great program, and we hope some of the other things are here back again if you see on the calendar. So again, we would love for you to return now that you were able to find us where we are. So with that being said, one who does a lot of great things, and I'm glad she's part of our community, Pat, would you take it from there?
Welcome everyone to the June meeting. We are very happy to be here. As he said, my name is Pat Hughes. I'm part of the board of the Upper Salford Historical Society, along with Ginny Ward is in the back, Luann Pullen, and Barb Wormley. So we are the board of the Historical Society. Before we begin, we want to issue a huge thank you to Pastor Ed Von Arsdale and the group here at Tabor United Methodist Church for having us in our group. Louder? I don't do this one. How do I do this? There we go. All right, is that better? Whoops. That's about as far as it's going to go. All right, am I on? Okay, am I on? All right, good. Okay. So, they've provided refreshments, which is wonderful, so make sure you help yourself before you leave. We appreciate the continuing support of the Tabor United Methodist Church. Rick Sachs is going to lead us in the pledge to the flag. Before we begin, I just have a couple of announcements. On the table in the hallway is lots of information on the Historical Society and events that are happening in Upper Salford Township this summer. So take a look before you go. There's one new thing there that is called the Montco History Pass. There's a paper about that. This is an app that you put on your phone, and it will lead you on a journey of 17 historic parks, houses, museums in our area. The closest one being the Gemein House at Old Goshenhoppen Church. The farthest one is the Mather Mill in Fort Washington. So what you do is you go to the website, download the app, go to the place. When you get there, you check it off on your phone. It registers with them. And bonus, you get points and you can get prizes. So take a look at it. It runs all year long. So it's not something you have to rush out and do in July or in a certain amount of time. So have fun with that. The other announcement is that our Facebook page has a link to our YouTube channel. Several of our past programs have been put onto the YouTube channel, thanks in great part to Sean Lisitsky for helping us out with that. More of them will be coming, so check that out as it goes along. Luann, you had an announcement?
We just did the memorial
Okay, on to our program. In January of this year, Ginny and I attended a consortium of 10 area historical societies in Boyertown Historical Society building. It was a best practices meeting, and it was very informative. Ideas were shared, and contacts were made. And one of those contacts is my meeting, our presenter tonight, Ryan Conroy. He is the president of the Springford Historical Society, and he speaks to different groups on a variety of topics. And we chose the Underground Railroad, thinking it would be of great interest. And judging by all of you here, it is of great interest. So we're very glad you joined us tonight. So, Ryan, you're on.
Okay.
Read this.
I think my mic's already on, right? Either that or I'm just talking real loud. Okay. Well, thanks for having me tonight, and thanks for everybody coming out. Of course, with the weather being a little funny today, we'll see what happens. Not to jinx anything, but I did a talk one time that was kind of similar, and all the power went off, like at one time, and it was like pitch black, and then luckily it came back on like 5 minutes later. But we had still went through with the talk. But so it's nice being able to work with other local historical societies. Of course, our historical society is Springford Area Historical Society. We actually we're kind of unique where we actually cover two separate entities, where we actually cover Royersford Borough and Spring City Borough. And so what else does that also cover? It actually covers two different counties. So we're kind of in a unique situation, and our building's actually located at 526 Main Street, right in downtown Royersford. We own a 1860 farm estate house, and we have museum space throughout the house, and a restored pole barn behind our building. That's gallery space, and we have all kinds of different artifacts and programs that we do there. And actually, we had a program tonight that we actually had to cancel because of the weather, because it was outside in our pavilion. But anybody that has children, tonight would have been, but it's got postponed. But if you check our Facebook page and our website, we started doing a summer kids program that is free, and we do at least 4 separate ones, and they're usually pretty interactive with children. The one tonight was about the history of children's games going through history. We have another one where we have a blacksmith coming that's going to do a demo, and they actually have stuff set up that the kids can actually make something. So stay tuned for that. But tonight I am here to talk about the history of the Underground Railroad in Montgomery County, and my talk that I have been giving specifically, because I've done a lot of them in this little region here, is I've created a new talk that was geared a lot towards how the Pennsylvania Germans were involved. And how many people in here have Pennsylvania German descent? Probably a decent amount, as usual. So usually when I do the talk, we have a lot of people that can relate to it. So it's really interesting. I personally have been interested in Pennsylvania German history for a long time, and then I had been giving talks on the Underground Railroad in different areas of Montgomery County, Chester County, and in Berks County. But that subject kind of kept coming up, and I started researching it, and it wasn't easy. Actually, two combinations of things there, where one of the hardest parts about doing talks on the Underground Railroad is actual documentation that exists, because it was an underground operation and things weren't documented on purpose. And then even after the fact, years after a lot of that stuff had cleared up, people still were destroying records because they felt as though they still could get in trouble for it. In other words, so a lot of things aren't documented, and it takes a lot of research and talking to people. And one of the fun parts about doing this presentation specifically is usually almost every single talk I have somebody in the crowd that comes up to me afterwards and has some sort of connection. They might know of a farm locally that it was rumored to have a stop on the Underground Railroad, and if anybody has that information, I'd be more than happy to hear about it and look into it, because I'm going to actually include some of that stuff that I've be given in my talk. So as my talks progress, I have more information that I share with people that you find out. So when I start my talk tonight, I actually always like to start with this painting, because I feel as though this painting is one of the really nice, accurate portrayals of what the Underground Railroad would have looked like. And as you can see, they're not underground. Okay, so that's number one. So on the Underground Railroad, most of its operations were above ground. It was called an Underground Railroad because, number one, it was underground. It was secretive. It was almost like the French Resistance in World War II, where it was referred to as an underground operation. Okay, so it's very, very similar. Same exact description. So underground being, secretive, and then the railroad part was kind of something that was it became a terminology, because then they started using terms related to the railroad as station master houses or things like that were connected to the terms of railroad. So that kind of is the easiest brief description of what that means. But looking as this painting shows you is pretty much what it would have looked like. And you have children here and women portrayed in this painting, really showing what the clothing would have looked like. What's nice about this painting was the painting was actually done in 1867. So this is only a few years after the Civil War had ended, and not a few years after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. So this painting is portraying something that is really accurate. And it was painted by a man who, ironically, was of German descent. His name was Theodor Kaufmann. And it's just a fascinating painting. You can see as they're kind of coming out of a wooded area into an open area. Now, you're talking about Montgomery County in that time frame. The majority of Montgomery County consisted of farmland. And your more condensed population areas in Montgomery County, there actually wasn't a ton of them before the Civil War. Town-wise, I mean, Roarsford, for example, wasn't even an incorporated borough yet. It was still consisted of like 4 or 5 farms. And then you had to go to places like Pottstown or Norristown, or areas around like Plymouth Meeting and areas that were more condensed populations. But everything else in Montgomery County was very rural, small little villages. Of course, where we're at here in Waxhaw, that was a good example of a classic Montgomery County town, at the time period. It was very small, very village. Everybody obviously knew each other. So it's very, kind of give you a picture in your head what it looked like. So Montgomery County at the time, being very rural, would have looked, something similar to the open farm areas. Crossing open farmland was very common in that time period for what was going on. So therefore, they really relied on housing, houses, barns, things like that where they could take shelter, maybe get clothing, maybe get food. And then, involved in that is where you're going to find the hiding places, hiding places that were built, secretively inside houses, inside barns, maybe tunnels that went underneath of a house into the barn were somewhat of a common thing. But really was one of the main things was creating some sort of hiding place inside your house, so that if the bounty hunters were coming to look for the slaves, that they could hide them, and that happened a lot. And I'm going to talk about a very specific story here soon. But anyway, so when the Underground Railroad had started, its history goes back way farther than what you might think. So, and this is where it's really interesting about the connection, our first connection with Pennsylvania Germans. So, of course, going back to day one, 1683 is when the first 13 families came to the United States from Germany and settled in what was, of course, still known as Germantown. Germantown at that time was not part of the city of Philadelphia. It was its own entity. And Germantown, consisted of the first German immigrants here in the United States. And they came from a couple different backgrounds. Generally, most of them were Mennonite, and then you had German Quakers, which you don't hear about a lot. But German Quakers were definitely a thing. And of course, your Pennsylvania German history. It's not all cut and clear when it comes to where they actually came from specifically. Not every quote-unquote Pennsylvania German was actually German. You had Swiss, you had Austrians, and you had Dutch. So you had those names, and you'll see those names, mixed in amongst those first 13 families. If you do genealogy and you happen to be lucky enough to be able to trace your roots to some of those families, you're going to see some of those names, and they're clearly you'll see last names that are definitely Dutch, like Dutch, not Pennsylvania Dutch. And so anyway, in 1683, when the families had first come here, you had English Quakers, Welsh Quakers that were already here, and some of that was that connection with the German Quakers. Don't look outside. Was of course William Penn recruiting Quakers in Europe to come here to the new colonies. Quakers now were being recruited from other countries. They weren't just English, of course, like we said. You had Welsh Quakers, you had Scotch Quakers, you had Irish Quakers, and then, of course, the German Quakers. And one of the things that was really interesting is that when specifically the Mennonites that came here to America, of course, they were coming here because of religious persecution. And so when they came here, they thought it was very unusual that they come to this place that's supposed to be free, but yet there were people being held captive as slaves. And they thought that didn't jive with what they believed in. And ironically, a lot of the slave owners were Quakers, which is something you don't hear about a lot. Now, of course, going down the road, of course, like that, Quakers were probably more involved in the Underground Railroad than anybody, but they did own slaves in that time period. So a lot of the German Mennonites thought, hey, wait a second, like these guys have slaves, this goes against our religious beliefs, and they kind of went immediately down the route of abolitionists and were against slavery pretty much from the beginning. So there was a very important document that was written, which is pictured here. I don't obviously expect you to read it. Even if it was maybe in front of your face, you might not be able to read it either because it's in Old German, and it's very difficult to translate. But this is what is known as sometimes you see it referred to as two different names: the Germantown Quaker Resolution or the Germantown Mennonite Resolution. The reason why sometimes I think you see both those descriptions was because the Quakers and the Mennonites in Germantown shared congregations. Okay, so before they could build their own churches, that was very common. That kind of stuff occurred into the 1800s with Lutherans and German Reformed. It was very popular. And how many times do you see an old church and here's the Lutheran church, and then literally across the street is the UCC church or the German Reformed church? That's because originally a lot of times they were together, or sometimes referred to as union churches, like the Goshawpen church right down the street. So, but anyway, this document was the first document and first publication of any sort and the first form of protest against slavery in the United States, in the colonies. And it was written right there in Germantown, and signed by some of those first 13 families that were here. And some of those 13 families are some of those families that had the immediate connections that came out into areas of Salford Township. Salford and Skipback, of course, were some of the early, the next areas that were populated by Pennsylvania Germans outside of Germantown. Skipback was the second one. So they, obviously not too far from here, and it was those families all originated from these people. And what's really cool about this document actually is, number one, it still exists, okay, and number two, it still resides in the Germantown Mennonite Church. And so you can actually go visit the Germantown Mennonite Church and actually see this document, which is pretty cool. The other item that they have there, which is really cool, is this table. This table was actually the table that was used to write the document. What was really interesting about this table was, pretty classic Mennonite thing is documenting, right, and archiving things, and not just Mennonites, but Pennsylvania Germans in general always had a mindset for history, and thank God that they did those things like they did even back then, because that's where a lot of our references and our research comes from. But that table they kept all those years, and it also still resides in the Germantown Mennonite Church. And you can actually visit that as well. That picture is really small, so it's like, yeah, it's a poor quality image. It was, but what's really interesting is that actual table itself was used by somebody who you might recognize the name, that lived not too far from here. It was Christopher Dock. Okay, Christopher Dock is one of the leading ministers of Pennsylvania German history in the United States. He created a lot of teachings that are still used to this day by ministers as ways of teaching their faith. And Christopher Dock actually used this desk in his office and as a teacher, of course, with the Mennonite Academy. And so it was really cool. It actually traveled around but stayed within the community. And it was a very important thing because it signified that action of that anti-slavery movement, which is just really fascinating. It's in the Germantown Mennonite Church. Yep. This is the only description or portrayal of what the first Germantown Mennonite Church looked like, which was built in 1708. So, like we mentioned, they were here in 1683. So you're talking, over 20 years, 30 years before they actually had their own church. And that was because they would meet in the Quaker churches, or they would meet in each other's houses. But this was the first one. It was a log church, just like the Gemein House, right? Which we're lucky that we actually still have. Which is what correct me if I'm wrong, is the oldest German church in North America that's still standing, right? Yeah. So when I found that out, it blew my mind, honestly. And I actually got to go there I work for Liberty Thrift, and I do pickups in my truck, and I got to go do a pickup at the church recently, and I got distracted, obviously, very easily. The minister was showing me stuff, but anyway, that's what that looked like. And that would have been a very typical looking structure in Pennsylvania German areas all over Montgomery County. Most of their first structures were either log, and if they were lucky enough, they were early stone. But the early Lutheran churches, like the one that's near me is Zion Lutheran on 724 in East Pikeland Township. And that had a log structure that looked just very similar to that. So this is a messy map that I like to call it, and it's routes of the Underground Railroad from 1830 to 1863. And as you can see, the lines are just really crazy. They're all over the place, and that kind of gives you an idea of what routes would have been, because it wasn't always cut and clear. It wasn't like, okay, we'll just go this way, and everything went that way. There was a lot of distractions. There was a lot of things that had happened where they would have to reroute. And that crazy map is showing, multiple states. Here's Illinois and Ohio. But right here, this little super condensed little spot is us in southeastern Pennsylvania. And southeastern Pennsylvania is arguably, maybe the most important area during the Underground Railroad. And that a lot had to do with because of the amount of people that were involved in it. Okay, but you also had areas like Philadelphia, and Reading and things like that had large populations and had a lot of involvement, but it was also a route from Maryland and Delaware, which of course were both border states during the Civil War. So both of those states had slaves, and they were super close to the border of Pennsylvania. Okay, so it was a hot spot, and because they knew like, oh, well, all I have to do is get over the Pennsylvania line into Chester County. And I might be okay. So it was that close for them to be able to get away. And, and of course, a lot of them were leaving, Virginia and the Carolinas. And you can see even some of these routes going out into the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, like we were saying, not everything, it wasn't much of an underground operation, literally. Some of them actually took boats out into the Atlantic Ocean and went all the way out and avoided the coast here as much as possible and went all the way up into New England and going all the way into Maine. And so a lot of the routes sometimes actually went directly into Canada. And so a lot of slaves that had escaped slavery in the South were like, you know what, I'm just going to leave the country completely and just get into Canada. And that's where a lot of that had occurred. So this is a little more specific map that kind of shows you Chester County. Now, Chester County was a huge player in the Underground Railroad. And what was so important about Chester County, too, was obviously here, you got your borders of Delaware and Maryland, and then these important routes coming through here, this green, red, and purple were the main three routes through Chester County. And as you can see where they're going, two of them are going right into Montgomery County. Okay, so Chester County was very important in it because it was the stepping stone before Montgomery County. And those two, Montgomery and Chester County, were very closely connected because of that. And a lot of that had to do with the Schuylkill River. And getting over the Schuylkill River was a big deal, was a big obstacle. We're going to talk a little bit about this area very specifically here in a little bit. Not everybody, came through farmlands or went on a boat and went out into the ocean. There was a very famous incident that had happened that was publicized in newspapers in the North at the time. And this description of this etching is actually called The Resurrection of Henry Box Brown at Philadelphia, who had escaped Richmond, Virginia in a box 3 feet long, 2.5 feet deep, and 2 feet wide on a rail car. He actually put himself in a tiny little box, and that's not not the shortest trip in the world from Richmond, Virginia, into Philadelphia on a train at that time, and that was his route to get into the North. And they said they opened the box and boom, he popped out, and everybody was laughing and thought it was funny and whatever. And so they had an artist actually portray the incident, and it was published in like the Philadelphia Inquirer and like the New York Times and all the big newspapers at the time. Just a pretty cool description, but it kind of shows you there was all kinds of crazy stuff like that had happened. All kinds of stuff like that. So there was a couple different incidents that had occurred, and I'm going to just touch on them real quick. One of the first laws that was established was by the state of Pennsylvania. Of course, Pennsylvania was the first state to abolish slavery, and that, of course, had to do with everything we just talked about, and the Quakers and the Mennonites, and that they put this law into place called the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780, and passed by the Pennsylvania General Assembly, and it wasn't all cut and clear, and that's like what the Underground Railroad is practically all about, is that sometimes you might see a law and it was put into place. Well, it wasn't just like, okay, well, yeah, it's done. Pennsylvania is done with slavery. You can't have a slave in Pennsylvania. That's not what happened. The gradual is the catchword there. Pretty typical law that the government will pass is they put little catch words in there, and there's all kinds of little red tape in there and small fine words in the actual document. Well, what that meant was that you could still own a slave in the state of Pennsylvania. up until the age of, you remained a slave, and their registered children would be enslaved until their 28th birthday. So the person that was the adult could still remain a slave for the rest of their life. It was if they had a child, and that child could still be a slave until it was 28. That's what the law was. Okay, so it wasn't just like, oh yeah, Pennsylvania abolished slavery. That's not what happened. And they believed that there was still slaves in the state of Pennsylvania up until 1850. You're going to find that kind of stuff like in very rural areas, even though this is what we maybe today call a rural area. It wasn't that rural at the time that you could maybe find still people having slaves in Montgomery County would have been very unusual. You're going to find them more in like central Pennsylvania and sometimes in those areas. Even today, central Pennsylvania is not like eastern Pennsylvania, as we all know. There's a reason why it's called Pennsyltucky. And it was just like that then. It was the same type of thing. And so that kind of stuff lingered on. And we're going to talk about something like that at the end of the talk that is very interesting. And then the other law that had gotten passed in 1850 was called the Fugitive Slave Act. And when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed by the United States government, overriding all the state laws, it was bad. Because what that meant was a state within the United States that owned slaves had the right to actually track down their escaped slaves in other states and quote unquote bring back their property. Okay, so that gave the right to some slave owner in Virginia to hire a bounty hunter to come into Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, and hunt down their slave and bring back their slave for $50 or whatever the bounty would have been. When that had happened, that really, really escalated the Underground Railroad time period. Because what that did was now it forced the Underground Railroad now to be even more underground, and it forced it to become even more of a secretive thing, and it really became dangerous. And that's where, even say I was involved in the Underground Railroad, and I had a farm here in Montgomery County, and I was an abolitionist, and I had slaves come into my property, and I had them at my house. If I got caught, I could actually be prosecuted by the United States government, and I would be fined and I could be put in federal prison. Okay, so that was why it was so dangerous, because even the people that were involved, like not only could they be prosecuted by the law, they could also be killed by these bounty hunters or people who just didn't agree with them. Okay, it was very dangerous, and that's why it made it so secretive and important. So I'm going to talk about one specific person who's my favorite person involved in the Underground Railroad, and he happened to live in Chester County, but he lived right on the border, and was one of the main connections to the Underground Railroad that brought the slaves from Chester County into Montgomery and into areas like we're in today, into Salford Township and into Franconia and areas that are very obviously almost practically 100% Pennsylvania German, at that time period. A lot of things revolved around churches. Okay, so this here is a picture of the Schuylkill Friends Meeting House, which is the Quaker church in Schuylkill Township, right outside the borough of Phoenixville. Like, as soon as you leave the borough, it's right there. It's still an active Quaker congregation, and if you're familiar with the area that I'm talking about, it's literally right off the intersection of Route 23 and White Horse Road. Right on the one kind of off the intersection is John Kennedy Ford dealership, okay, and Total Rentals right there where you can rent your backhoe. And then sitting on the other corner, like in the back there a little bit, is where the Quaker church is. And then we're going to show you. I'm going to show you a picture of another structure that's off the other corner. So yeah, this is a very Quaker church. Anybody know why there's two doors? Yep, men and women. Yep, men and women entrances. And one thing that you're going to see, like I said, sometimes it was just like with the bounty hunters and different things like that. And this is like right before the Fugitive Slave Act, 1849. People could put ads into newspapers and say, hey, I'm looking for my missing property, and put rewards into newspapers. One of the known, and it was very unusual, but you got to talk about the facts and the history, of course, is that it was very unusual for anybody that was Pennsylvania German to own a slave, but it did happen. And one of the people that owned slaves that was a well-known Pennsylvania German in our history was Peter Wentz. Okay, now the Peter Wentz homestead, of course, is in Montgomery County. It's not terribly far from here. It's a historic site. Peter Wentz owned a bunch of slaves. And at one point, he actually had some that escaped his property. And he put ads in the newspaper, looking for his property. And they put rewards in there of amounts of money to anybody that could find them. And it was fully documented, like in his tax records and everything, of them living on his property, 6 or 7 slaves at a time, I believe it was. So it was not common because of the Pennsylvania German religious connection is really what they based on was their faith. They believed that it was wrong to own another person, and that was the gist of it, really. And so when you talk about Mennonites, you're talking about all of the Pennsylvania German backgrounds. Of course, the Mennonites were the first ones here, but literally almost at the exact same time, and like right after that, of course, you have Lutherans. And you have the German Reformed, and you got your Gosha Hoppins and your Schwenkfelders and all your many, many little backgrounds of the Brethrens and the Dunkards and all the different Pennsylvania German Christian religious backgrounds. All were anti-slavery. And so anyway, just a pretty neat little ad. It kind of shows you where they're, here's, look, Delaware Gazette, Dorchester County, Maryland. So these are 2 states that were border states. And one of those people that would have had to, deal with the bounty hunters was this guy, and this is the guy that I was starting to talk about, is Elijah Pennypacker. And of course, most of you might recognize the last name Pennypacker, okay? So yes, he is related to the Pennypacker family. They're all related to each other, and there was a bunch of them. Elijah was directly first cousins with Samuel Pennypacker from Pennypacker Mills, which is obviously super close to here. And that family, generally all the Pennypackers were anti-slavery. And you're talking about a family who was wealthy. He could have owned slaves easily if he wanted to, but they were Mennonite. Okay, so the Pennypackers were generally mostly all of Mennonite background and were anti-slavery. Elijah lived in Schuylkill Township, right near where the Schuylkill Quaker Church is. And he married a woman who was a Quaker. So now you got the double, you got the Quaker and the Mennonite, and they were both super anti-slavery. Elijah converts over to be a Quaker because of his wife, and they both get super involved in the abolitionist movement in southeastern Pennsylvania. He's a really interesting guy. On the other corner from where the Quaker church is Elijah Pennypacker's house. Like I just said, they had money, clearly. This house looks exactly the same, and honestly, it was actually just for sale less than a year ago. It was over $1 million. Okay, it's an incredible, early colonial farm estate. Right in front of the house here is the barn. It's still there, and the house it just sold. When I saw it was for sale, I pretended I was actually going to buy it. And so I got to see the inside of it and take pictures. And it was really interesting because most of it's original. It hasn't really been touched much. It was really cool. But still standing there. So you can actually drive there, to this day and see those 2 things that I'm talking about. Elijah Pennypacker, I said, was a really interesting guy. He actually served. He got involved in politics. He served as a state representative in the 1830s. He believed that Number one, this is his words, he got tired of politicians, and he also felt that they weren't doing enough for the abolitionist movement. So he quit as a politician and went back to his house and pretty much just, became he already had the house and everything, but it was like, a gentleman farmer, and lived at his house and then completely dove in the abolitionist movement himself with him and his wife. And this house and him became a station master, and this was a very well documented stop on the Underground Railroad. Elijah then dug a couple tunnels. He dug a tunnel that went from underneath his house into his barn, and a tunnel from the barn underneath White Horse Road into the woods. And those were used multiple times. And what's really interesting about Elijah is that he was one of those people who actually was able to relay some of his stories first person. There was a book that was written in 1882, and it's called The Underground Railroad in Chester County and Its Neighboring Areas. And it pretty much covers, like, here as well. The book is great. It was really hard to find for the longest time until it was, someone republished it, and you get it on, like, Amazon now for, like, $11. It's called The Underground Railroad in Chester County and Its Neighboring Areas. This guy, it was written by the man by the name of Smedley. He actually went around the area, all over the area, and first person interviewed people that were involved in the Underground Railroad. And he's one of the only people that is known to actually do that. So his book is extremely important for people like me and people that are interested in it, because he actually went and sat down with Elijah Pennypacker in his house and said, tell me what you did. Okay, so the book is really interesting because they'll talk about that stuff. And of course, like as I was talking about in the beginning, a lot of these people still weren't super willing to give that information because they were still concerned, I technically broke the law. Are they going to come after me? Or, so there was that concern. So even Elijah himself was still I'll tell you a couple things, but that's it. Okay? One of the things that he talked about was, yes, I did keep a logbook of every slave that came through my property, but I burned it. Okay? And then he said that they estimated, from Elijah talking about, that they estimated that he actually processed, supposedly, over 300 slaves through his house, which is a lot. He talked about two incidents that I will share with you quickly about 2 times where he almost got caught. One time was he was actually in his barn, which the barn is unusually close to the house. It actually faces the front of the house, which is very odd. And it's literally maybe 30, 35 yards from the front door. It's really weird. But he's in the barn, and he actually was in the barn with some slaves. And 2 bounty hunters showed up at his front door. And he had, I guess, seen them, and he was like, oh, shoot, I better get out of here. Let's try and get... But he wasn't, as a lot of these people were, number one, they were brave, and 2, they cared about the people that they were helping. And so he knew that it wasn't just him he had to get out. He actually was trying to get everybody out. And his mother-in-law knew what was going on, and she was living at the house at the time. And the bounty hunters come to the front door, and according to Elijah Pennypacker, who obviously seemed to be actually a pretty funny guy, he'll some of his stuff that they quote from him, he definitely had a sense of humor. And he mentioned about how his mother-in-law had the gift of gab, and he said that the bounty hunters went to the front door, and she delayed them enough by talking about what type of pies that she liked to make that he was able to actually get them out under the tunnel into the woods, and they never got caught. And so she must have been really good, honestly, because those guys didn't search the house, and things like that. So it kind of shows you how, like, even these random bounty hunters would find out about people like this. Because guess what? Not every neighbor was neighborly, okay? Not every neighbor was super anti-slavery. They had to be really careful with that kind of thing, because bounty hunters could be like, hey, I'll throw you a few bucks if you give me a hint, okay? So it was a constant thing. The other incident had happened with Elijah was he was known to actually go with some of the slaves from his house. Once he had taken care of them at his house, he would actually go with them to their next destination, which was also kind of unusual. He owned a couple horses and a covered wagon, and he put he said there was about 6 of them, and he put them in the back of the wagon and covered the sides and took them right through downtown Phoenixville and wanted to take them across the river where Montclair is, over in the Montgomery County. Okay, the destination at that point, like I said, is to get into Montgomery County. And specifically try to get over the Schuylkill River. Okay, so he had to get over that bridge. At the time, it was actually a covered bridge that was there. Well, once he got to the edge of the bridge, bounty hunters came out. They were hiding underneath the bridge because they knew that people were being transported through here. And once again, he got confronted, and he himself talked his way out of it, and probably talked up, I'm a doctor and blah 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 and all this kind of stuff, and they didn't search the wagon, and they're lucky, and he got him across the river in the Montgomery County and into the next location, which I'm going to show you here in a minute. So Elijah Pennypacker is a really interesting character. You can do a whole talk on him. But this is his very modest, very typical Quaker gravestone. It's like literally like this big, and it has just his name on it. And it's right there behind the church. What's really cool about him and his burial is you have him, you have his wife, a couple of his children on the same plot, and then there's another grave that's actually on the plot, and it's actually the grave of an African American that actually they found that he actually adopted a small boy that came through his property that didn't have his parents with him, and took him in as his own son, and he raised him. And he actually winds up enlisting in the Civil War and fights for the Union Army. And there's also another military headstone in the same cemetery of another black soldier that's believed to have a very similar connection. So it's really cool, really neat history. And it obviously shows you a lot, that the fact that he had him buried on his family's plot. Right across the river, did anybody, I know that picture is not the greatest, but anybody know where that's at? And it's in Montclair / Port Providence. Fitzwater, yep, exactly. So that's what's called the Fitzwater Station. It's still an open tavern restaurant. Actually has really good food. That was one of the very next stops across the river, and of course the canal, for Elijah to be able to take him. So John Fitz was actually involved in the Underground Railroad and was also a station master. Now he's in Montgomery. Now they're in Montgomery County. Okay, and another very important location, which is actually, like I said, like very cool, because you can actually go there today and go eat dinner there with your family or whatever, and actually be inside the building where this stuff occurred. I believe I think they even have some of that history on their menu. Right here is another shot where you kind of get an idea. Schuylkill River's right here, and here's the Schuylkill Canal. So you have to get over two bodies of water. The canal's deep, so like they had to be able to get over 2 sections there to get into Montgomery County generally, all up and down the line there. Of course, I know you had a speaker recently talk about Fractor. This is just, I always like to show this pretty typical example. So Pennsylvania Germans would use their art for obviously all kinds of different things. I think it's one of the most interesting forms of art. And of course, back then they thought it was just their art. You know, they didn't think much of it. Of course, now, if you have one of these things, it's worth thousands of dollars. I guarantee you they never thought that was going to be the case. But it was, you know, classic example of folk art. There are signs of them using fractor and different things like that to signify anti-slavery. Very small symbolisms and different things like that that would have been used. And so it's really kind of an interesting thing, and I just like this one because it's an owl. But going through different areas of Montgomery County and kind of, you know, you get into areas that are a little higher up. And another one of the areas that was super involved, and it was another destination point, was Norristown. And this is a shot here of the Norristown Friends Meeting House. Still standing. Very interesting, cool, early structure. 2 entrances, of course. That kind of gives you a nice sight. You can actually go see that. Before we talk about this, I wanted to talk about a couple of locations that are really close to here. And you know, two of these had come up when I did a couple talks. I did one for German Reformed Church in Souderton, and the Souderton Mennonite Home, and the Mennonite Heritage Center. And I had a couple, one man had come up to me who was 98 and grew up on a farm right outside of Franconia. And he had told me this really interesting story about a location that is known, and some people recognize this name. You might even know this name. It's on County Line Road, and right at the top of the hill, it's called Ingram's Hill. Okay, Ingram's Hill. Some people just know that name, and it was because it was settled by a man by the last name of Ingram. On top of that hill, there's a house and there's a farm, and it's all farm areas around there. The man had lived on a farm that was right across the street from it, and there was a lot of stories and rumors of the Underground Railroad coming through that farm. And he had talked about when he was a small boy in the 1940s that him and his friends used to go down into a couple of the underground tunnel areas near the house and play inside the tunnels. And it was really interesting because, you know, you'll hear stories like that. Some people just didn't think much of it. You know, probably one of the most common questions I get when if I do the talk or people come up afterwards, they'll be like, I think I have a hidden tunnel, you know, on my property that was used in the Underground Railroad. And, you know, unfortunately, most of the time, it's a root cellar or a cold food storage area, like in a typical 1700s or 1800s, like Pennsylvania German farm, like around here. But a lot of times, you know, people get excited and they want it to be something, and sometimes I have to be the bearer of bad news. But that is generally, most of the time, probably going to be the answer. But sometimes it's not. That's a good example of one. I've heard 2 other people tell me about that. And it is written about a couple different areas about that area. Another one is actually right on Allentown Road, not too far from there. Anybody know where the Rising Sun Inn is, right? Okay, so it was originally known as Gerhardt's Tavern. And, you know, the Gerhardt family was one of the first Pennsylvania German families to settle in that area. And the Gerhardts were known to be anti-slavery and abolitionists. And there's multiple stories and accounts of that location, the tavern itself, being involved in the Underground Railroad, being a stopping point, being the fact that it was a tavern at the time, dating obviously back to the 1700s. It was a place where they can provide food, which was super important. You know, someone like Elijah Pennypacker, you know, might not have been able to provide a lot of food to them. You know, providing shelter, maybe some, you know, clothing. You know, they might be able to clean up and different things like that. But, you know, finding locations like Gerhardt's Tavern that could actually have food on the premises was extremely important. So people like Elijah Pennypacker would have been aware of other locations like that. And that's like sometimes people will ask that question, well, how did they know where to go to next? And that honestly was one of the hardest parts. It was, and also one of the most important parts. Somebody like Elijah Pennypacker had to say, okay, well, you need to go this way. And he had to give pretty darn good directions. Okay, you're talking about giving directions to people who literally have never been in Pennsylvania in their entire life, trying to tell them, you know, this is the 1800s, okay? So there's not street signs, okay? So you had to say, oh, well, go down the road to this tavern and go west this way. It must have been really difficult. But knowing main spots like that, like Gerhardt's Tavern, would have been a very central spot because it was a very established tavern in the 1700s. So by the time of the 1850s, it was very well known. And of course, you know, not too far from there, where you have, we talked about Christopher Dock, you know, at you know, Dock Academy, which is of course the Mennonite Academy, which has a rich history in itself. The administration building that's on the property there was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and that's very well documented. So 3 prime examples of locations that are still standing. And generally, you could almost kind of count on it. If there is a Quaker church or an earlier Mennonite church, probably came through there, most likely. And it might not be documented at all. Because you got to think about it, you know, had these ones that were like, you know, main stops or things like that, there was all kinds of people that were involved. People like us, you know, that might have just had, you know, a little farm, you know, doing our thing, but they believed in it and they wanted to maybe be a contributor in some form or fashion, but didn't want to be like, hey, I'm a station master, like, you know, bring 400 people through my property. They might have wanted to be involved in a smaller way where they could maybe provide some sort of service to it, you know, because you had big gaps, you know, in between those areas. So there had to be people in between there that knew about it, that could help them with directions or whatever it may be. So always thing that I think about is, you know, how many other people were involved that we don't even know, and there's probably a lot in Montgomery County. One of the places that's very well documented is right in the center, right in the heart of Plymouth Meeting. In Plymouth Meeting, right at the intersection of Germantown Pike and Butler Pike, is the original center village of Plymouth Meeting. It was completely built up around the Plymouth Meeting house, hence the name. And right across the street from the Plymouth Meeting House is the Corson House. The Corson family were very well-known abolitionists going back to the 1700s. And during the Underground Railroad's, you know, heat of it, especially in the 1840s, 50s, early 1860s, this house and the Meeting House were major stops on the Underground Railroad. This is the back of the house. Right behind the house is this really neat stone barn, okay? And has, in my opinion, is I think one of the most important historical sites involved in the Underground Railroad in the country. And that's because something that we were talking about, existing structures and existing this and existing that. This place was actually built specifically to be a meeting place for abolitionists. And it was built in 1857, and it was actually named and called at the time Abolition Hall. So they were pretty much like, yeah, this is what we're doing, like, stop us, pretty much. Like, this is pretty bold. This is a bold move at that time. Abolition Hall becomes a very important central location for all the abolitionists and station masters all over the area, and of course specifically in Montgomery County and in Philadelphia County. And so it becomes such a significant location because the family already had some connections, and there was very famous people now that were going to come through this location. And so when they would have their big meetings, they would have abolitionist meetings, and they would have to have a speaker come and talk and you know, get people riled up, or, you know, give them information or whatever it may be. And you know, they had people that were some of the most famous people involved in the Underground Railroad were there. People like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. So, you know, probably two of the top dogs there. That you can't, hard to argue that. And there was a documented account that Frederick Douglass was almost assassinated multiple times. And one of the incidents had occurred in Philadelphia. And he had escaped, and this is where he went. So, like, really, really fascinating building. Believe it or not, and this is why it's important for us historians and people that are interested in our history and preserving our history, is all that history that I just told you about this place was almost torn down about 5 years ago because they wanted to extend Butler Pike through there. That's it. That's it. Oh, we just want to make the road a little bit bigger. So we're just going to knock down like one of the most historically significant buildings for the Underground Railroad. And so even something that significant was almost lost. Not just the barn, but also the Corson House. So, and what was actually really cool about that was people fought it and won. And what was really cool, even cooler about it, some of the main players in it were the actual Quakers from the Plymouth Meeting House, who ironically were the ones involved in building it in 1857. Pretty cool. So I always like to talk about that. There is a Pennsylvania State historical marker right on the edge of the road. It's easy to miss. But so if you ever come up in that area, I highly recommend just like going there and seeing this stuff. I was preparing to do this talk recently, and a lady had reached out to me who actually went to school at the Quaker Church and became a teacher. I think she did like Sunday school or something like that. And she's like maybe like a little bit older than me. So it wasn't that long ago. And they said, oh yeah, well you should come over and visit sometime. I can take you down and show you the hidden passages like that are underground and underneath the church. And I didn't even know about that. So just look at it. Here's a site that's known that people don't even know that those are down there. And they say, oh yeah, we should take the kids down there for Sunday school and like show them like the hidden passages for the Underground Railroad. And I'm like, well, can I look at that? Like, is that a... So I'm supposed to go over there, and I'm hopefully going to take a bunch of pictures, obviously. But there's like full-blown like hidden tunnels and stuff, like hiding places and all kinds of stuff underneath that building. Here's the sign. So yeah, I said 1857. Built in 1856, and you know the actual house was built in 1767. So that's just historically significant to begin with. But the Corsons were super involved in like Philadelphia and like all kinds of, like they were early families. I think they came here in the 1600s and like all kinds of interesting stuff. What's really cool is in Abolition Hall later on, 1881 to 1895 was actually the art studio for the son-in-law of Mr. Corson, Thomas Hovenden. I don't know if you ever heard of him. He's a famous artist, mostly based in Philadelphia. I think he did a lot of impressionist art and different things like that. That was his art studio, and ironically, that's where he painted his famous painting called The Last Moments of John Brown. So it's a very famous painting, but it was painted actually in there. Pretty cool. Here's the Plymouth Quaker Meeting House. Yeah, looks pretty similar to the Schuylkill one. Same. This one's actually much older than the Schuylkill one. But just a really neat place and still an active congregation. And of course, we talked about Harriet Tubman. You know, one of those people who's obviously one of the most popular people, I guess you could say, when it comes to the Underground Railroad, and probably rightly so. She was extremely involved, and went through a lot of obviously dangerous operations herself throughout the area. And what's really cool about her connection to our area is that she is documented to have been in Montgomery County many, 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 many times. And that goes to show you why do you think she was here? Because Montgomery County was so important to the movement that she felt that she needed to be here and talk to all these different people. And so very cool And of course, she's got a lot of connections down in Philadelphia. There's a fight actually right now currently to save one of the houses that she lived in that wants to be torn down by a developer. And of course, she lived in different areas throughout the United States, and there's a couple different museums for her around. But another cool location that you can still visit, which I highly recommend if you're interested in Underground Railroad history, is the Kennett Meeting House down in Kennett Square, literally right down the road from Longwood Gardens. So if you're ever down there, you can actually go to this, which is also an actual Underground Railroad museum, which there isn't a lot of them. So I highly recommend that. This is one of the most famous photos taken of abolitionists. And in this photo, there's a bunch of famous people in this picture that were super involved. William Lloyd Garrison, like different people like that, are all in this photo. And this building looks almost exactly the same. And it's really cool. Highly recommend it. And this building here, which is actually, I always like to throw this in, and it's not in Montgomery County. Does anybody know where that's at? And you might know, it's in Adams County, and it's in Gettysburg, and it's literally right in the center of Gettysburg. And this is the Dobbins House restaurant and tavern. If anybody likes going to Gettysburg, or you haven't been there, the Dobbins House is obviously it's a 1700s tavern, and it's right in the center of Gettysburg. And Dobbins House, Dobbins, Dobbins. Yep, Dobbins himself was an abolitionist, and this place is just really cool. Number one, they have good food. Okay, and if you ever go there, there's a more of an expensive restaurant on the first floor, and then if you go downstairs, is the actual 1700s tavern, which is actually way cooler. But the tavern is really neat. So you can another place that you can actually go visit and be actually inside the building and see something. Now, what's really cool about the Dobbins House is that it actually has a viewable hidden passage. So we always talk about these hidden passages, and a lot of this stuff is on private property, okay? These things that we're talking about, you can't just go there regularly and see these things. But this is one of the places that you can go and see one with your own eyes, and it's open all the time. So inside the house, this was, he was a station master, just kind of like Elijah Pennypacker. And there's a set of steps that go near where the tavern is, and it goes up into the second floor. And if you're going up the steps, it would look like this. Okay, so you got a set of steps, these little doors, and a inset shelf. Doesn't look like much. You got a lot of crockware and things in there. Well, the door, this thing actually slides inside the wall, and behind it is a full-blown hiding passage on the side of a stairwell, which is really interesting. That right there is, I always like to show that because that is literally one of a really good example of what something would have looked like in a regular house, like these places that I'm talking about, places right here in our backyard. That's what you're going to see a lot of times as an actual hiding place. Okay, so they had to it kind of goes underneath this little eaves area, and you can get in there and you can kind of stand up. I can't stand up in there. But you kind of crouch down in there. But it is known that he hid multiple families in there at the same time. And bounty hunters came there looking for him. He hid them in there and had the thing closed, and they couldn't find him. It's like in a movie. And that's exactly what happened. And so people were really creative with these hiding places. Yeah, you could do tunnels and things like that. That's putting tunnels underneath your house it's a lot of work. Right? You're digging that by hand. That's some serious stuff. So sometimes they would just create these little hiding places like that in underneath eaves. I was doing a talk, and recently there's a house. I'm supposed to go visit it, and it's over in East Coventry Township in Chester County. And this family owns the farm. The family that owns the farm is the same family that has owned the farm since the 1820s. And they told me a whole story about how it was a stop on the Underground Railroad and that they have all these hiding places inside the house. And they described them to me. And it sounds exactly like this. And it's not even, this is a good example of something that you would think that would be documented, and it's completely not even documented. Like, nobody even knows this. Okay, so I'm supposed to go over there and see this, but they described something kind of similar to this, but it was a door. And what's really weird about it is the door shuts, and the outside of the door is just plain. But on the inside of the door, there's a lock, like a wooden latch that latches only from the inside. Okay, sounds kind of obvious. Okay, and it's like inside of like a little eave area. It's very similar. And then they were telling me this. They did tons of research on their property, and they said, and there was this mysterious fire that had occurred during the same time period in the barn, not in the house, but in the barn. The barn was burnt down, but before the barn was burnt down, somehow all the animals were taken out of the barn before the fire had happened. And they were all safe and fine, okay? So there's a lot of like interesting things going on there. And that's a really good example of something that you would definitely see around here, for sure. Because what do you got a lot around here? Barns, right? So, and of course you had even more of them in that time period. But really cool example. And so, really just a couple interesting quick facts before I end my talk and, open it up for any questions and things like that was, kind of give you an idea of, slavery and different things like that would have been occurring in Pennsylvania. Montgomery County had slaves all over it. Going up into, through the 1700s, and they believed that there were still people owning slaves in Chester County, Montgomery County, into the 1830s. And once again, like you're talking about that gradual abolition act, and it wasn't until the Emancipation Proclamation, came into effect and was officially in effect January 1st, 1863. That literally made it now illegal for you to own slaves in the United States. But when you talk about communications at the time, right, and things like that might have not have been communicated or conveniently not communicated, okay? And this is now where you're going to get into another history in which some people do ask about this and wonder where it came from. So in 1865, you had a general for the Union Army who had actually gotten down into Texas. And Texas, at the time, during the Civil War, it was obviously a full-blown Confederate state, but there was not many battles in Texas during the Civil War. It was very deep south. But eventually, the Union Army, of course, did get down into there. And in 1865, in June 19th, okay, so Civil War's over. Lee had already surrendered at Appomattox. So in June 19th of 1865, Civil War now you're talking about Union General, Major General Gordon Granger came into Galveston, Texas, and with the news to specifically spread the news that the war had ended. Now remember, the war is over, but down there they were like, no, it's not, right? So he went down there, and this was a common thing that was now occurring, to go down into these areas and telling people, hey, I'm a very pro-union. My whole family's from Pennsylvania, so they had to tell them like, hey, your favorite guy Lee surrendered to us. You lose, pretty much. That's pretty much what they were doing, but also telling them, hey, you can't own slaves anymore, and you can now be arrested for that. Now the tables have turned. Okay, so. They were down there spreading that word. So note, obviously, 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, people were still owning slaves in the United States. And it was because you get into those backwoods rural areas in the Deep South that who the heck was going to know, right? It's pretty pretty basic. People just didn't know, or they chose to ignore the fact and were going to do it till they got caught. Okay, and therefore that is why, and that's where the celebration of Juneteenth comes from. Okay, that's specifically where it came from, and it was specifically celebrated in Texas for most of its history, and because it was a very specific thing to that area of the United States, but that's where that occurred. And it was really common. What they did was they celebrated on June 19th every year with big barbecues and picnics and family events. And that was what it was. So it's really interesting how, the history of slavery on the Underground Railroad can be very, very complicated. And how it just wasn't very cut and clear. Like even in Pennsylvania, where, first state to abolish slavery, but they still had slaves here 50 years later. Okay, so it was very complicated. And, facts are facts. Luckily we lived in an area where anti-slavery was so big, but you also still had people who were not, and who believed in still wanting to own slaves, and they voiced their opinions about it. So you definitely have both sides of it, but it was they were very, very much in the minority, okay, in that fact, and that was because you had a very, very large population in southeastern Pennsylvania of Pennsylvania Germans and Quakers, and those two factors there were huge in the Underground Railroad and the abolishment of slavery. Like I said, the first. You always remember this fact, and I think it's super interesting, is the first form of anti-slavery protest occurred in Germantown by German Mennonites and German Quakers. And that was in 1688. So you're talking, how many years later before the Emancipation Proclamation? So 180 years, okay? Even from now, 180 years ago, that was before the Civil War. This year, we're celebrating is the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. That seems like a completely foreign time period. So you think about that time period from the 1600s into the 1860s. Okay, it's a long time. That was a long battle. So that is a little history. So I think I'll wrap it up, and if anybody has any questions or input, please feel free to go ahead and raise your hand. Yes?
Where were they taking the slaves? Were they going to Philadelphia?
Yeah, so yes. One of the things that, and I'm going to show this here real quick at the end here, is they were using certain areas were could be final destination areas, and Philadelphia was definitely one of them, and that had largely to do with because Philadelphia had a large population of free African Americans already. Okay, so you had people like very wealthy black business owners in the 1700s in Philadelphia, so Philadelphia was a good spot to go to. Reading, Norristown. Like I said, sometimes they were just like, you know what, I'm going to go as far north as I possibly can. And you'll see a lot of communities that developed in like Burlington, Vermont, okay, or like in Canada. And what's really cool is, and this is just a very good question, because sometimes if you kind of just keep your eyes open and you see things around our area, okay, a lot of times you're going to see little communities that were formed, and there's always going to be a church. That's number one. And a lot of those churches, the congregations that were formed, the most common denomination at the time was AME churches. And AME churches, of course, are still very active. But AME churches were very based around the Underground Railroad itself, and then some of them were established like right after that by freed slaves. So you'll see little communities like that sometimes, and they're really random. Like, anybody know where St. Pete's Village is? Right? You know where St. Pete's? Right behind St. Pete's on Harmonyville Road there's like this wooded area. You can miss it easily, but there's this little wooded area, and there's a marker right on the edge, and it's actually marking there's a graveyard in there, and it's specifically all black burials, and it was because there was a community that was formed there of people that were escaped slaves. So, that's one way you can tell, because sometimes our area was safe enough that some of them could stay, and then some of them just chose to keep going. But yeah, it's a good question. Yes?
You talked about that law that when the bounty hunters could come out and get them. One thing, my wife and I just saw something on the Underground Railroad, and the thing that struck me is when that came out, a lot of people, especially up in the farther north, the whole communities would just pick up and go across the border to Canada, because Britain, it was illegal to have slaves. So all they had to do was get up, but they said then after the emancipation, they just came back.
Yeah.
But when you mentioned that about whole communities, that's what reminded me of that.
Yeah. It's a good point. I mean, the bounty hunters were that was one of the worst things that happened during that time with that law. It created so much of a problem. And unfortunately, like I said, it was done by the United States government. And so it made it a federal law, and that's why they could go over state lines. And that's where it became very dangerous and violent, and there's all kinds of stories with that. And yeah, any other questions? So one thing I wanted to mention, I almost forgot, which is something people usually like the most, and didn't want to leave you guys out. There's just like Underground Railroad stuff, there's something that's been loosely documented, and there's some people believe it's completely made up, and some people are adamant that it's not. And one of the things, if anybody's really into quilting, sometimes referred to as freedom quilts. Now, freedom quilts, the definition of a freedom quilt is new. Okay, so the term using a freedom quilt is a new term for something that was created in the 1800s, possibly, as a quilt that would have been used in the Underground Railroad. Now, one thing that I didn't talk about earlier was, like we kind of mentioned it, where how like some people might not want to be super involved, but they wanted to play their part. Okay, so you might have had people like craftsmen who, a blacksmith that could make tools and gift them to them, so they had something. Obviously, what do Pennsylvania German do? Some of the best of all times is obviously make food, and so providing food was a big thing. And some of those things they believe were possibly tied into symbolisms within quilts. Okay, so there is a couple quilts that are located in the state of Vermont that the State Museum actually owns, and they refer to them as these quilts, and they're in a couple different quilt books and different things like that. I had done a talk up in Berks County at a church, and this really nice little old lady who was in her 90s came up to me, and she was an old Pennsylvania German lady, and she came up and had made quilts for many, many years, and knew that I was coming to talk, and before I got there, she made me a quilt, which is like one of my favorite things that's ever happened at one of my talks. And what she did was she made this quilt for me, and it's a sampler quilt, which samplers were used today as samples of different quilt squares that you can make. You can make use one square like this for the entire quilt, but it was a sampler, so it shows you different things that are in it. Samplers were used, back in the 1700s for quilt making. This is a sampler quilt that's based off of one of the ones in Vermont, and it belongs to one of the. I think it's the State Museum that actually has it. And on the quilt, you would have had this one has 15 squares on it, and each one of these squares signifies a different sign, in other words. So what they believe that they might have been used for was you would have had a regular quilt, and then inside the quilt you might have had one of these squares inside the quilt, and you would hang the quilt outside of your house, either on the porch, on the clothesline, and hopefully within the view of a route of the Underground Railroad or whatever. And if somebody saw that this and was aware of what it actually meant, that they could get that sign. Okay, so it's really interesting. Like I said, I'm not going to lie. There's some people who think that it's a fantasy type thing, but there are people who do believe that because there are a couple documented quilts, and were they used on it? Who knows? But one thing that we obviously know is very significant of southeastern Pennsylvania is quilts. Okay, and they believe that some of these quilts were possibly used, obviously, by Pennsylvania Germans in our area, and because some of the quilt meanings are very specific, and so I'm going to read them to you. I'm going to, I don't know if you can, I might be able to hold it here, if you guys can see it. So I'm going to start actually, and I'm going to read these to you real quick. This one here means railroad tracks, and it follow the tracks to the next sign to get back onto the Underground Railroad route. This one here is called the log cabin with black center. It means there's housing here for blacks or a safe place to build a cabin for the winter. Something that's really interesting that you don't think about maybe a lot is obviously they were traveling all season. Okay, so it might not have been in the summer, it could have been in the winter. And one of the most important things that they're going to need is shelter. And there were many accounts, where they actually would build temporary structures and in the area. This one meant crossroads. It meant change direction at the crossroads. Here is the North Star. Head towards the North Star to the safe end of the road in Canada. The one next to that is called Monkey's Wrench. Visit the blacksmith or gather your tools for the journey. This is my favorite one here. It's called Shoe Fly Pie. It meant get some food here. Pretty basic. The one down there is called the Basket. It meant food here. Gather goods in a basket for the journey. The next one is called Birds of the Air. Wings point the direction to go. The one after that is called Bear Claw. Follow the bear tracks or go through the woods. Next row down on the left is called the Stars. Safe area to sleep under the stars. So they didn't always have houses and barns to sleep in. Okay, sometimes they just slept in the middle of a farm field, but they knew it was a safe, area. The next one is called the Wheel. This is where they can find transportation. One next to that is called Flying Geese. Follow the geese for the direction to go. Bottom left is called Bow Ties. Good place to get good clothing to go unnoticed in the city. Very specific, but a really important one. When you think about that, remember as I was talking about how some people would contribute in different ways, there's a lot of documented accounts of tailors or just housewives that could sew and make new clothing for them, so they didn't look like obviously like a slave. Okay, they didn't look like this. So they could make them a little bit some nicer clothing so it wasn't obvious. So they could go into, like, say, Philadelphia and just kind of fit in with the communities that were already there. Next one's called the Ship. Safe passage up the lake or good way to get across the water or on the ship. And the last one on the right is called Dunkard's Path. Watch out, you are being followed. So it's a really interesting thing to talk about, obviously, and and the lady who had made this for me was very well aware of these quilts, so it was really cool. And this is the description that had come with the sampler, and so really interesting. And I'm glad I remembered that because I almost forgot. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thanks for coming. Okay. Yeah, and just, like I said, if you're ever interested in seeing our museum in Royersford, please stop by. We're open on Wednesdays and Sundays. And then we have a lot of events coming up. And, of course, we're working with Upper Salford on doing this wide range, you can kind of call it southeastern Pennsylvania because we are covering a bunch of different historical societies. Yes? Underground Railroad in Chester County and its neighboring areas. The guy who wrote it, his last name is Smedley. So yeah, we're working on this event, and obviously stay tuned for that, because when we started doing, we put together these roundtable discussions. We had at our historical society. One thing that I always thought, and we talked about that, is, why don't we work more with our other friends and our neighboring historical societies? Because we do have a handful of them around here. And that's one thing that I always noticed. I was involved at Phoenixville Historical Society for years as president before I was president at Springford. And same thing at Phoenixville, where I was just like, yeah, you got our neighbors here, and everybody has questions or problems or ideas, and we would like to share those with each other. So we started these roundtables once. We have, 3 of them now, right?
I've only been to one.
3, yeah, 3. We had one at Boyertown Historical Society hosted one of them because they're involved. We have one at Springford.
Do you have a card or your address or your directions?
I don't have one with our Historical Society address, but we're the best way to find it would be online, either on our website or our Facebook page. That has all our information.
I came kind of late. I'm sorry I didn't get
It's okay. It's okay. Yeah, we have a very active Facebook page and a very active website that has all our events and stuff on it. But, Springford Area Historical Society.
What is it?
Springford Area Historical Society. Yep. So that event we're going to be doing is going to be in September, and we're working with all these historical societies, Upper Salford, Limerick, Boyertown, East Vincent, and we're going to be putting together a 3-day event that is going to be a publication where people can actually go and tour all the historical societies within 3 days, and each one of them is going to do something. It might be at a historic site, it might be at their historical society, and each one's going to say, stop at Upper Salford and do this. And it's our way of kind of hopefully joining together a lot of our areas. Anybody who either lives or knows anybody that lives at Peter Becker Home, I'm doing another talk on Thursday. That's free. And that's going to be about the history of immigration in southeastern Pennsylvania, covering everything from Pennsylvania Germans to Italians. So we'll probably cover every single person in the room, I think. So anyway, yeah, thanks. And hopefully you'll see you soon. Yep.